Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all participants joining us from across Africa and those connecting from other regions. It is a great pleasure to open this webinar on the primer on data for trading services and development policies organized by UN Trade and Development UNCTAD. Today's webinar builds on the rich exchange we had during the earlier webinar on January 23rd, while focusing on Africa. That discussion brought into focus a reality of today's economy. Services are no longer peripheral to development. They are key to shaping productivity, competitiveness, and diversification. Services are deeply embedded in production and trade, and they are increasingly at the heart of digital transformation and participation in regional and global value chains. At the same time, countries face a persistent challenge. Services remain too often insufficiently measured. In many cases, policymakers are being asked to design trade, digital and development strategies without the full evidence base they need. When that evidence base is weak or fragmented, it becomes harder to identify opportunities, diagnose constraints, and more importantly, design coherent and effective policy responses. This challenge is especially important in Africa. Services sit at the heart of the continent's policy agenda. They are essential for connectivity, logistics, finance, telecommunications, tourism, business services, and the digital economy, among many other activities. Services are equally important for regional integration, for productive transformation, and for advancing the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. But this is also a moment of opportunity. Africa recorded a 13% increase in exports of digitally delivered services in 2024. This is the highest growth rate among all world regions. However, in spite of this very positive number, this is still very low. Africa represents less than 1% of global exports in this segment. So this underlines both, on one hand, the continent's potential, and on the other hand, the importance of having stronger data for policy and policy analysis. This is precisely why the primer is so important. The primer offers a practical guide to the services data landscape. It helps policymakers, analysts, and stakeholders understand what kinds of data exist, how different data sets can be used, how they complement one another, and where important limitations and gaps still remain. Above all, it helps move us from a broad recognition that data matters to a more concrete understanding of how data can support policymaking. In Africa, this matters greatly. For policymaking, trade statistics alone are not enough. Policymakers also need to connect trade data with other forms of evidence, including, for example, regulatory indicators, firm-level data, and implementation experiences. Better data, without a doubt, can help identify where opportunities lie, where bottlenecks persist, and where policy action is the most needed. In this regard, let me also note that today's conversation forms part of a wider and continuing agenda. The next multi-year expert meeting on trade, services, and development, to be held here in Geneva on April 15 and 16, will focus on servicification for economic diversification. This reflects the growing recognition that services are core inputs across all productive sectors and are central to diversification. Importantly, a dedicated segment of that meeting will focus on data for trade in services and development policies, providing further space for exchange and for peer learning. So we are continuing to build a shared conversation on how the primer can be used in different development contexts and how it can be further developed. While many data challenges are common across regions, policy priorities are often specific to each regional setting. That is why exchanges such as this one today are so valuable. Our program today reflects exactly that purpose. We will begin with a presentation of the primer, followed by a panel discussion, and then we will open the floor for discussion. I really hope that this exchange will help all of us to identify practical ways in which the primer can support policy making in the African context and contribute to ongoing capacity building efforts. Let me conclude with a very simple message. Better data on trade on services is not merely a technical issue. It is a development imperative. I thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to a rich and productive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Luz María de la Mora, our Director of the Division on International Trade and Commodities here at UNCTAD. Thank you so much for kicking off our webinar. With that, I would like to invite Professor Borchert to give us a presentation and introduction to the primer and what it is about and what it does.
Thank you very much, Peter, and a big thank you to Director de la Mora for the introduction and, more importantly, for supporting so vigorously the role of data in good policy making, which is a development imperative. My name is Ingo Borchert. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Sussex in the UK, and I have been a member of UNCTAD's informal working group on data for services, trade and development for several years. I'll kick us off with a short overview of the primer, followed by some thoughts on next steps as a segue into the panel and the dialogue with participants who are on the call, which I guess is a really important part of this ongoing conversation. Services trade data is obviously a huge area, and so we could have written another sort of massive publication on it, but that's exactly not what we wanted to do, right? By contrast, a primer is a short, accessible introduction into everything you need to know about a given subject, and here that's trade in services data. I'm afraid it's a very technical and complex area, and as a result, many users do not find it easy at all to be able to identify and find the data that they require for their policy making and analytical purposes. And therefore, the primer provides a one-stop shop for consolidated guidance, information, and discussion about data on trade in services. It essentially makes 4 contributions. It starts with a basic introduction into measuring and understanding services trade data, which is not quite trivial. And I'm quite keen on making it clear that the primer is not supposed to be duplicating any work by other UN agencies or other international organizations, all the valuable work that is going on there. There is, for instance, digital deliverable services have been mentioned already in the introduction. There is, for instance, a multi-agency handbook on measuring digital trade, right? And all the statistical and conceptual detail is out there in its authoritative detail. But chapter 1 of our primer is a very quick way of just getting everyone on the same page about what you need to know. Secondly, the core part of the primer then is a comprehensive synopsis and overview of the services data ecosystem, which I'll provide some more detail on in a minute in the next slide. Thirdly, the primer also starts moving beyond services trade data and signposts some of the complementary data sets that could be used in conjunction with services trade statistics, because most analytical and developmental policy questions will involve an amalgam of many different kinds of information. And the primer lastly concludes with some policy recommendations on capacity building, on better use of already existing administrative data sources, and about knowledge sharing of best practices across developing countries, because so much good work is already happening on the ground. Now, for Africa, the data situation is probably particularly precarious because many African economies are relatively small, relatively poor. And so one message of the primer here, I guess, that there is perhaps still a surprising amount of options that exist for accessing services, trade data, and policy in Africa. Let me now quickly say something on each of the 3 substantive chapters in the primer. The first chapter collects in one place, as it were, not only the conventional aspects of how we go about measuring services, so the extended balance of payments classification or the different modes of supply of services trade, but importantly also this idea that services, a lot of services are being traded indirectly as embodied services inputs. And that's an important aspect in the upcoming multi-year expert meeting that was referred to in April, an important agenda item of which is servicification. Plus, there is, fourthly on that slide, a bit of a general discussion on the most common challenges that users of services trade data ought to be aware of. There are some idiosyncratic things out there that people better know about, which are different to goods trade, such as, for instance, unallocated trade flows across sectors and across economies is much more rife, unfortunately, than in goods trade, or the so-called trade asymmetries. And because of all of these complexities, all the data sets that are out there, and to which I'm going to come on to on the next slide, they all differ in various ways. They differ in coverage, they differ in the intent by which they were created, and all of this is then great. All of these trade-offs are laid out in greater detail in the next 2 chapters. What are the most important sources of services trade data? Firstly, that's balance of payments data. They are global in coverage, complete data set. They cover modes 1, 2, and 4. Because of being balance of payment statistics, there are various sources. UNCTAD is amongst the most important sources of them, but the WTO and the IMF also provide data in that realm. And these balance of payment statistics are being complemented by foreign affiliate trade statistics, or FATS for short, which are supposed to approximate mode 3 trade, which is exchanging services by establishing commercial presence abroad. And as was noted earlier, this important mode 3 trade is largely invisible from balance of payment statistics. Mode 3 is quantitatively the most important way of trading services. A lot of important policy questions revolve around it, such as opening your own market for foreign investors, and opening up foreign markets for your own businesses, which sometimes is more commonly known as export promotion, but that might very well just be squarely mode 3 services trade. So FATS data are a really important part of the picture. Now, in addition to that, there are various data sets that are constructed for specific analytical purposes. For instance, if you wanted to know about digitally deliverable services and what are these services that has just grown out of Africa by 13%, as the director said in her introduction. There are other constructed data sets, such as the trade flows by mode of supply, the WTO TISMOS data set, or the fully balanced trade and services data set. Thirdly, that's item C on the slide here. There's a completely different kind of data that actually looks at services value added, or generally speaking, the value added in trade, which might well be services. And that's this area of value added trade data that is being compiled partly by the OECD, but by a couple of other providers as well. And the sources differ between OECD developed economies and emerging markets and developing economies, and the primer discusses and signposts all of these. And lastly, there are, as I said before, we are focusing primarily on services trade data, but the primer also signposts some complementary data sets. Because alongside services trade flow statistics, you might also want to know about services trade policies. That's probably the most important other aspect to go along with trade data. And so the WTO, World Bank, services trade policy data set is being discussed, as is the World Bank Enterprise Survey, which is the only important publicly available global firm level data set. For instance, from the enterprise surveys, you get this information about firm level sales being split between domestic sales, direct exports, and indirect exports. And that's something that's a very important kind of information to look at if you are a policymaker. Importantly, many smaller African economies are covered by the enterprise surveys. Every small economy in the world is covered sort of on a rolling basis by these enterprise surveys. And so even for smaller economies for which the data situation usually is not so good, there's a sporting chance that in the enterprise surveys there is something on firm level data. Now, this is in one slide sort of the formal coverage, the full scope of the primer. But let me make the point that apart from there being official statistics on balance of payments trade data, as well as purpose-built data sets, the primer goes one step further, and the primer discusses how these data come about and how these data are being constructed and what that implies for the way in which we might want to use the data and in appropriate ways in which we can interpret the data. An important example here is item C, trade and value added data, or the trade by modes of supply data set, which are largely constructed data sets, and that puts a constraint on what these data can then be used for. Moving on to how the data is being presented in the primer. Every data set in the primer is being headed up by an at-the-glance box that summarizes the most important key facts about the data set. Here on the left-hand side, you have UNCTAD's flagship data set on services trade, and already that flagship data product comes in 3 different flavors. And you see certain trade-offs. One manifestation of these services trade data come on a quarterly basis. That's really important if you want to monitor or keep track of policies or trade flows. But then the quarterly data are not available on a bilateral basis, but only as a export and importing to the world basis. Whereas the annual data, that's the first column, is actually available on a full bilateral basis. So you already see the trade-offs here. By contrast, the other at-the-glance box on the right-hand side is an example from the OECD's trade in value-added data set. You see immediately by comparing these 2 boxes, this is a completely different way of measuring data. Trade in value-added is on an industry classification basis. It's on an ISIC revision 4 basis, which is different to the services product trade flows on the left-hand side. I think these boxes do a good job in making many of these key characteristics and differences and trade-offs across these data set easily discernible. And most importantly, you will notice on the very last row of all of these boxes is a row called access. So every at-a-glance box has a direct link, which is good, which was correct at the time of printing the primer, with a direct link and access to these data sets, which we hope are particularly practical and valuable to policymakers. Now, going forward, we hope very much that the primer is going to be a capacity building resource that will lead to a wider usage of services trade flows and more analysis, because that's going to be front and center to so many development strategies, as the director said at the beginning. Technically, there are big changes in statistical frameworks immediately upon us. We're going to move to the 7th version of the Balance of Payments Manual. So just from a technical perspective, it will be important to update the primer pretty soon, just so that these latest frameworks are being reflected. But more importantly, going forward, it's important to keep the discussion going. There will be a discussion about servicification in a month's time in April at the MIAM. And servicification really is all about the embodied services inputs. And for that, again, the primer makes a good contribution by discussing these kinds of data that you would need in order to map out and get insights into servicification. Going forward, there are a couple of ideas, substantive ideas, where the primer could be, and where the primer and the conversation could go from here. I think it's important that the primer is being developed further around topics where the payoffs are being biggest to analysts, right? That could be in digital technologies, that could be in services trade costs. And that is partly because I think more and more jobs and prosperity is going to be linked to services and services trade more than ever. So we need to have the data, and we need to have the proficiency to use and analyze the data. That's quite essential. I'm not going to go into discussing all of this for want of time, but on a methodological note, ending on a methodological note, let me say that the future of developing into these directions really is in terms of microdata. So we need more firm level data, and we need to build the legal and statistical capacity to produce more granular data, because then we can also have more granular policy insights. Now, that's not going to come for free. And so clearly there, if there are civil servants from capitals on the call and are listening, it is clear that that will require some resources. The primer is publicly available on UNCTAD's website. You have the link here for directly accessing the publication on the slides, which are going to be made available. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and back to you, Peter.
Thank you, Ingo, so much for the primer on the primer. Now we have a distinguished panel from across Africa, West Africa, East Africa, South Africa, and Professor Hoekman from Portugal, who will talk about what can we do with service trade data from different perspectives. So we will start with an academic perspective, where two researchers from the University of Nairobi will tell us a little bit about their findings from recent papers that use services trade data, and what are the policy takeaways from these papers. And they will discuss a little bit what kind of data they used and what was missing and how it can be improved. So with that, I will give the floor first to Mr. Churchill Erick Achieng. So,
thank you very much. Let me just put up my slide. I hope you can see my slides. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Churchill Erick Achieng, and I'll be making a presentation on a paper I worked on together with Socrates, Majune, and Professor Idrissa from Thomas Sankara University. Now, the title of the paper is The Effect of Traditional and Modern Services Exports on Economic Growth in Africa. A bit on the background of the paper. We found that services represent the most rapidly expanding segment of world trade, and accounting for almost a quarter of total global exports. Now, at the same time, the growth in goods exports has slowed in contrast to services exports, whose growth has outpaced the global GDP growth. And this divergence presents opportunities for developing and less developed countries to diversify exports and leverage services exports to drive economic growth. Now, the existing empirical literature find evidence of growth-enhancing role of services. However, there's little understanding of the relative influence of modern versus traditional services in this dynamic, particularly in the African context. And additionally, most of the existing empirical literature treat service exports in aggregate terms and consider individual countries as opposed to Africa as a whole. And our study sought to plug this gap. And we used a panel study covering all the 54 African countries between 2000 and 2023, and used the two-step system generalized method of moments. Given the nature of our data, where the number of cross-section exceeded the time dimension, and we considered 7 service categories. That's total services, composite traditional services, and the available subcategories, that's transport and travel. composite modern services and the available subcategories, that's computer and communications, and insurance and financial services. As to the main results, we found that of the 7 service export categories considered, only the composite traditional services and the travel services had a significant effect in driving economic growth, whereas the modern services considered were found to have no significant effect on economic growth. And a robustness check using the log of GDP per capita, the dependent variable, corroborated this result. And as to the policy recommendations, it was our view that policymakers should formulate policies that foster traditional service exports, particularly travel services sector, given the given its potential to drive economic growth. And said policies were marketing and promotion both locally and domestic and internationally to stimulate tourist demand, as well as strengthening tourism infrastructure and associated industries such as airline through more additional financing. Now, next is the data and areas of future improvement. We adopted IMS BPM 6 classification, and due to data availability constraints, particularly for the African countries, only for the 12 level 1 services were included. That's transport, travel, insurance, and financial services, and communications and computer and communication services. And we sourced this data from the World Bank's World Development Indicators and World Governance Indicators. And given the scarcity of the data, presents an opportunity for potential improvement in that inclusion of all the 12 level 1 service categories when they become available in future will allow for a more comprehensive assessment of services and the economic growth dynamics, as well as in relation to other economic variables of interest. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I give the floor to Mr. Socrates.
Yeah, many thanks. Just allow me to also share my screen. Kindly confirm that you can see my screen.
It's coming up, but it hasn't come up yet. Yeah, it's coming up. It's
Okay,
there.
many thanks. So to colleagues who are joining us, my name is Socrates Majune. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Economics and Development Studies of the University of Nairobi. This work is jointly done with Darian Mwangi. We have Enoch Masese, Ian Kangi, Brian Ondieki, and Khalid Abdi. So unlike the previous work, we will soon be showing you evidence of what makes us think that Kenya has a comparative advantage in services, exports of services. And the main important thing in this work is to address why is Kenya having a comparative advantage in the export of services. So the key thing here is when you look at the data from this table that we are seeing here is that whereas goods still account for most of the total goods and services, exports of services, roughly about 61% as of 2024. The share of actual services has also been fairly increasing from around 27% in the 70s to roughly around 39%. When you also look at it in terms of the actual values, you realize that services have actually grown way faster than goods, I think over 20 times since the 1970s compared to around 10 times for goods. Then when you decide to look at the trade deficit, that means, so the trade balance, that means looking at the values in terms of both imports and exports, you realize that goods have actually a trade deficit all across time, and it's actually been growing, while it's quite different for services. Nonetheless, you also realize that Kenya is one of the top 2 exporters of services in sub-Saharan Africa after South Africa. So this is one of the things that made us ask ourselves what exactly could be driving this performance, does it mean that Kenya has a comparative advantage in services? And if so, what are the things behind it? So to do so, we measured comparative advantage in services using the normalized reverse comparative advantage index, and came up with demand side and supply side factors. So some of the demand side factors are, for instance, world demand and also exchange rate. Supply side factors are, for instance, how much goods are also exported, the human capital, infrastructure, and financial development. Of course, this then is tested for traditional services, which are transport and travel, and also modern services, which are insurance and financial, and also ICT. Of course, the data then is time series ranging from 1975 to 2023. What we find is that there's a strong long-term advantage in traditional services, which has been declining, which is then also being replaced by a comparative advantage in modern services, especially financial services. The other thing is that when you come to the specific factors, what is standing out is that exports of goods and also global demand are clearly having a significant effect on the Kenya's comparative advantage in services, whether in the short run or long run. But then as for the other factors, that is human capital, exchange rate, and infrastructure, actually differ by the kind of service that you are looking for. Especially modern services tend to be quite crucial. Human capital tends to be quite crucial in it. What then can be done besides just strengthening Kenya's transport and travel export capacity to withstand global improve the linkages between the goods and services trade, and then sector-specific conditions such as, for instance, improving human capital. As we come to the respective data, as you've seen here, we mainly relied on macroeconomic data, but then similar to Professor Borchert's assessment is that availability of farm-level data will actually improve in understanding why is it that Kenyan farms are really having a comparative advantage in services, more so in these traditional services, that is transport and travel. Thank you, and back to you, Chair.
Thank you so much for these two examples of papers that show what can be done with services trade data, and quite interesting findings. And I think if you have comments on these, I would really encourage you to have these questions after the panel. For example, you mentioned that tourism is strongly linked with economic growth in Africa, at least historically, between 2000 and 2023. But at the same time, the other study suggests that for the case of Kenya, the revealed comparative advantage as measured in modern services is increasing. So these are very interesting examples. Now I will give the floor to Ms. Dorica Nkata. She's an advisor on trade in services for the African Continental Free Trade Area in the East African Community Secretariat.
Thank you. I hope you're able to see my screen as well.
I can see you.
Okay.
Yeah, it's always difficult to say, but we're getting there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're getting there.
Okay, so let's just quickly. Okay, so for the ESC, for the East African Community, let me first quickly introduce myself. My name is Dorica Nkata. I'm Economic Policy Advisor on Trading Services at the GIZ Support Program to the East African Community. I will not dwell to give the context of the East African Community. I bet that information can be found online and elsewhere, or even during the question and answer session. For the East African Community, in terms of data, data is conducted in line with the Balance of Payment Manual 6, covering the sectors, the 12 categories. We rely mostly on ITRS, the International Transaction Reporting System, and also administrative data, purely because it's cost effective, despite the challenges, which are well known. The coverage is limited. There's also misclassification. However, the ESC countries have been advised to undertake surveys, and they are currently undertaking service for some of the service categories, specifically on travel. Or the partner state, the 5 partner states that are undertaking the surveys have focused on travel, and I also resonate with the presentations from the previous speakers on the importance of travel for African countries as well as East African community. For the other categories, only Rwanda is conducting fully fledged surveys, but there's interest in the other partner states to also do the surveys. This just gives you a snapshot of the current data on trading services exports in the EAC, and this information is collected from the central banks. These are the exports, which can also be disaggregated in terms of the sectors. We also have, I also provide, this slide shows the data on imports of trading services. If you look at the data from the ESC, it sort of mirrors to a larger extent on the data that is available on the UNCTAD stats. That is part of the primer. However, if you look at the digitally delivered services, on average, they contribute to about 6% of the ESC trading services. However, if you go to the details and look at the data in the countries, you realize that there are a bit of mismatch, some not making sense, some discrepancies here and there. For example, if you look at the data for South Sudan and you try to analyze some sectors that contribute to digitally delivered services. For example, I think if I look at the data on professional and management consulting, you see that there's data, there are numbers there, but if you look at the broader digitally delivered services, you find that the data is not making sense. So as pointed out by Professor Borchert, it's indeed problematic. Data in Africa and including East Africa is precarious, and we need to do more on that. Just to highlight some of the challenges that have been highlighted in the opening remarks by a director for UNCTAD, we in the ESC, there is generally irregular or non-existent surveys, which partner states have not conducted. They do not conduct because of the high costs. Not only that, there's also limited infrastructure in terms of capacities to prepare, to manage, and analyze the data, especially on the surveys. And most of the economic activities undertaken informally and do not reflect in the formal reporting mechanisms. In most of our countries, there are also data and statistical data in statistics, especially if you look at the data sharing between the central banks, the national statistical offices, and the key agencies responsible for the various services sectors. Also measuring digital trade, because the partner states are challenged in capturing the value of the digitally delivered services, because also to a larger extent they are limited monitoring tools. There's also challenges as far as data in digitally delivered services, especially in some sectors. And here we're talking about, for example, ICT and professional services. So in terms of these challenges, why is data important for ESC? So ESC is currently implementing commitments in 7 sectors that are part of the Common Market Protocol. And it's also in the process of preparing for negotiations in additional sectors that are part of the Common Market Protocol as well. So for implementation, I think it's important for ESC, and this I'm sort of repeating what the director for UNCTAD said in her remarks. We need data, quality data, to help us assess the economic impact of liberalization on the economies of East Africa. For example, its impact on employment, FDI, and GDP growth. It's also important to support monitoring compliance of the Common Market Protocol, as well as the Protocol on Trading Services, which ESC countries have signed to and they are implementing to basically assess the value of liberalization. Just as she had mentioned, it's also important for us to have quality, reliable, and timely data to assist ESC in undertaking regulatory reform, because at the time of implementing the Common Market Protocol, there's need for regulation to address certain inefficiencies, certain challenges, certain loopholes, but there's need for accurate data. But also important to mention that in cases of trade disputes between partner states, you need quality data to form the foundation and basis for trade disputes. In terms of the negotiations, data is very important for assisting the ESC, especially as we are in the process of preparing for negotiations for additional sectors. It will basically assist the countries, the partner states, in developing their negotiation strategies, basically to identify their competitive strengths and weaknesses, to identify sectors where they can prioritize for export growth, but also areas where the countries can either protect for national interest, but also even for regional interest, specifically if they're negotiating under the the African Continental Free Trade Area agreement. It's also important that in the negotiations, partner states are able to quantify the impact of market access commitments in terms of even based on the modes of supply, to understand to what extent have they opened up in the services sectors. Also important that the data, quality data, will assist the partner states to understand and measure the benefits of liberalization, analyzing the market access offers or improvements that and requests that have been made by other negotiating partners. So in terms of also moving on, so with this in mind, GIZ is in collaboration with the EU, is supporting the ESC to improve collection and analysis of data on trading services. So far, we undertook a state of play of trading services statistical data in the ESC. We did some capacity building on collection and analyzing of data, both at the regional level, but also in the national, at the national level in the ESC countries. We've also done training of enumerators at the national level in 5 countries that are under the pilot. Currently, we are supporting data collection and analysis in the countries, and we hope at the end of this process, this data will be consolidated into the first ESC Trading Services report. If we look at the current trade and investment report on the ESC, there's a bit of information and data on trading services, but we believe this initiative will be the first of its kind to have a consolidated report on the data flows on trading services within the region. However, because we are also alive to the fact that we may face challenges on sustainability of this intervention because of the cycle of funding, and we hope partner states can be able to take up and continue with undertaking these surveys and analysis at the national level. So far from ESC, that's the experience we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorica, for looking at some of the service trade statistics that are available, including an UNCTAD stat, and some of the challenges with that data, and some of the quirks, as you highlighted, like the management and consulting exports of South Sudan, which catapult South Sudan as a major exporter of digitally deliverable services in the region, which apparently it's probably not the case. You also highlighted that some things are being done to improve the situation, and we really hope that will improve. But it's not only about trade data, of course. It's also about regulatory data and other data as such. So with that, I will move from East Africa to Southern Africa, and I will invite Ms. Viola Sawere from the Southern African Development Community Secretariat, where she is leading a project on trade and services. I will invite her to the floor. Viola, you have the floor.
Yes, Peter, thank you very much. And just a little correction, I'm working with the SADC Secretariat as a team leader for the project supporting trading services, not Central Africa. That's what he said. Yeah. But otherwise, I will share a few pointers to what is happening at the SADC region and where do we need what type of information and for the reasons that we need such type of information. Just to bring into context, at the SADC Secretariat and in the SADC region, we have agreements that have been signed which sets our agenda on trading services. Firstly, we have the Protocol on Trading Services, which was signed in 2012, and it has entered into force since January 2022. We have some member states that are working towards their accession to the protocol, such as Angola, Union of Comoros, the Democratic Republic of Congo, as well as Madagascar. In addition to this protocol, we also have sector protocols that complement our trading services agenda. And all of these, such as the protocol to support movement of persons, the protocol to look at labor rights and labor agreements in the region, as well as sectors such as education and training, energy, transport, communication and meteorology, but sports, information and culture, as well as health sector, protocol, tourism, and finance and investment. Together, they set our trading services agenda. And looking into all those aspects, generally, the services sector in the SADC region contributes about 60% of our GDP. Of course, it differs from one country to another. For example, in Seychelles, as you know, it's part of the SADC member states. Services sector contributes to over 80% of the national GDP, whereas according to the available statistics in such other countries like DRC and other countries that are more resource and depend on mining, the contribution is a little bit lesser compared to those service-oriented economies. In general, it also contributes to about 30% of all total employment in the SADC region. And taking that into trade perspective, our available statistics only show that whereas merchandise trade contributes more than 50% of our SADC economies, I'm talking about trade. At the regional level, the intra-SADC merchandise trade is only 20%. And of course, we are finding it challenging to get intra-SADC trading services statistics. But according to the bilateral trading services statistics by the OECD and of course the World Bank and with WTO, it shows that we are only trading at 4.5% in 2021. That makes us, first of all, sure that we still need to do a lot of work to get trading services statistics, not only to show the importance in terms of GDP contribution and total employment, but also to look at how much we are trading in terms of export and how much we are importing within the region. That's my key point, within the region. So getting some tools, some databases where we can get the bilateral trading services statistics will help member states to make decisions. Having said like that, what are we doing at the regional level using the SADC trading services protocol? Of course, taking into account other programs that are happening at the sector level. We have completed our trading services negotiations in the first round, which we covered communication, construction, energy, financial services, tourism, and transport. And we are currently working on liberalization commitment, as well as any regulatory frameworks that are necessary to support liberalization of services, trade in business services, distribution, education, environmental, health, recreational, cultural, and sporting services. And this is, we have a deadline to complete such negotiations by December this year, 2026. Having taken into account that we have completed some negotiations, we developed a strategy which is aimed at improving services trade competitiveness compared to other regions in Africa, but also globally, to position services that are originating or being supplied from SADC to other countries as the best services, and of course, having worked on the quality. So in this strategy, among other things that is recognized is the need to improve competitiveness, but you improve based on the evidence provided by trading services statistics. So it highlights the need for us to work on trading services statistics, and also the need to improve digital trade and digital systems in order to support other programs in the region, such as the protocol on trade, but also merchandise trade, but also to support the SADC industrialization strategy and roadmap 2020, 15 and 2060 as the roadmap specify, which is also linked to the Africa Development Agenda 2063. So where are we in terms of data and what are our challenges? Of course, as Dorica mentioned, it's the same case in the SADC region, that we have some data that is available, but it's incomplete, and most of the data that is available is aggregate at sector level, and sometimes it doesn't give you the information that you need to know which country are you trading with and what type of services are you trading with. So most of the data that we rely on doesn't help us to make the decisions that are helping the regulators as well as service negotiators to make the right decision because of the gaps in the data. Also, we have noted that most of the data that is available, at least to the extent that we can rely on and compare between countries, is those that are coming from sectors such as tourism. But while data,
Viola, maybe you can wrap up.
Yes. So we need the data in a disintegrated format so that we are able to help to inform our decisions in terms of prioritizing, but also identifying the sensitive areas in the services sector, but also more important to support the regulatory measures that we need to undertake to support the agenda that we have agreed on and to promote investment in the services sector. But don't forget that also, as we move to implementation, private sector, they also need information on market intelligence. So it's not only where we are trading, but also to identify potentials for services, to identify risks in terms of regulations that are happening and what barriers are there to inform their business strategies, but also to convince institutions such as banks and other financing institutions to give them the finances that they need to support their international transactions that they do. So for us, we believe that with improvements that have been mentioned on the primer, we'll be able to get the information and build the capacity not only of the collectors of trading services statistics, but also the users to be able to use to get reliable data, but be able to have tools to analyze and fine-tune the data that is available to their needs. So let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Viola. That in SADC serves is important. Policymaking is on the move. You quoted one data set, that is the BATIS, the Balanced Trading Service data set. You said 4.5%. As the primer notes, around 96% of the data points in that data set are estimations. So we are right to point out this is the data that we have on intra-SADC trade. It is a very marginal base, but we have to improve it. As you said, there are efforts to improve it. So with that, I will invite Ms. Wange Dia, who will give a practitioner a perspective. She is from the Nigeria Investment Promotion Agency, and she will tell us actually what data she's using in her daily life in a daily work, and yeah, what data are you actually using in order to push forward Nigeria's investment policy?
So I'm going to introduce my organization, which is NIPC, is the Apex Investment Promotion Agency of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. It serves to contact all business communities, provide strategic support and guidance to investors, as summarized below. Project attractive image of Nigeria by promoting Nigeria and also giving information and investment opportunity to investors. Investment promotion, which is to promote Nigeria by Nigerians, and also coordinate all investment promotion activities in Nigeria. Investment facilitation, provide support services to investors and register enterprises in Nigeria, matchmake investors with specific projects, and advise on joint venture partners, as well as provide information on investment incentives. The last one, the policy advocacy, which is to NIPC initiates and support measures that enhance investment climate. It also evaluates the impact of investment and incentives in Nigeria, as well as advise the government on policies that will promote Nigeria's economic development. So this is the slide that I'm going to discuss on what the investment, So how do we promote investment? Or what data do we need to promote investment in all the sectors of the economy, inclusive of the service sector? So to effectively attract investment and promote efficient support services to investors, the NIPC use reliable, timely, and decision-oriented data across the investment policy cycle. This data is obtained directly or indirectly from key stakeholders within the investment ecosystem, which can be sourced locally and internationally. The data framework is structured across the key categories. Number one is microeconomic and market data. This is utilized to provide a broad understanding of economic environment. This includes indicators such as GDP size, the growth rate, sectoral contribution, inflation, exchange and interest rates, as well as population demographics. Includes income level, consumption pattern, and market size estimates. These are typically sourced from the Central Bank of Nigeria, the National Bureau of Statistics, and the World Bank World Development Indicators. Secondly, we have the investment and foreign direct investment data, which is critical for tracking capital flows and investors' behavior. This includes FDI inflows and outflows by sector and country of origin, distinctions between greenfield and brownfield investments, pipelines of announced and ongoing projects, as well as investor pipelines and trends. Key sources include UNCTAD, the World Investment Report, investment maps, and FDI markets. Third is the sector-specific data, which provide deeper insight into priority sectors such as agriculture, manufacturing, ICT, and energy. This includes sector performance, value chain analysis, input availability, demand-supply gaps, export potential, and industry cost benchmarks. These insights are derived from studies conducted by ministry departments of and agencies of Nigeria, organized private sectors, and stakeholders and development partners. The fourth one is regulatory and policy data, which is essential for understanding the business environment. This covers business registration processes and timeline, tax policies and incentives, licensing and compliance requirements, as well as trade policy and tariffs. Sources of this data can be gotten from B-Ready reports and the Global Competitiveness Index, alongside internal comparative analysis conducted by NIPC. The fifth one is investor aftercare and performance data, which focus on post-investment experiences. This includes investor satisfaction level, operational challenges, expansion and reinvestment trends, bottlenecks affecting business operations, and metrics on job creation and economic impact. This data can also be gotten from aftercare engagements with already existing investors, and platforms such as OSIC Lab, very important mechanic to solve investor problem. The last but not the least is pipelines and opportunity data, which highlights investment trends and projects and opportunities. This includes bankable projects, public-private partnership pipelines, state-level investment opportunities, as well as privatization, concessions opportunities. These are also sourced from NIPC, the UNIDO ITPO program, the Infrastructure Concession and Regulatory Commission, state investment promotion agencies, and Bureau of Public Enterprises. Together, all these data categories enable the comprehensive evidence-based approach to investment promotion, ensuring that investors are provided with credible, actionable, and well-conditioned information to support decision-making. The next slide is Nigeria Investment Attractiveness Dashboard. NIPC is collaborating with the International Trade Center to develop Nigeria's Investment Attractiveness Dashboard to be integrated into the NIPC website very soon. The dashboard is a data-driven investment promotion tool and provides investors with timely and credible information about Nigeria's economic opportunities. The dashboard will be utilized to conduct evidence-based investment promotion activities, guide targeted investors outreach, assist in making informed business decisions, and gather relevant information for aftercare service and policy advocacy. The last slide is improving on data collection. How do we improve data collection? We believe establishing an integrated data system will help create central investment data platform linking state IPAs with key government agencies to share real-time investment data. Also strengthen investor survey and aftercare services. Regularly conducting investor perception and satisfaction will help understand investors' challenges and resolve them. Here we can engage with National Revenue Service of Nigeria to get feedback from taxpayers. The last one is improving interagency collaboration. We believe that collaborating with other agencies of the federal government, the regulators, and those that are checkmating the firms will help us collate relevant information from all the stakeholders that will help us in achieving how to improve data collection in Nigeria. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Dia, for giving this overview of data sources that are being used when your agency wants to promote services for firms, either going into Nigeria or out of Nigeria, and also some information about how your agency sees how data collection and aggregation and coordination could be improved. So thank you so much for that. With that, I will give the floor to Professor Hoekman to round off the panel.
Thank you. So let me just say a little bit, to go back to the primer. There's a chapter in the primer that Ingo mentioned, which looks at complementary sources of data. And these include firm-level surveys. So the World Bank Enterprise surveys are mentioned in the primer. And the nice thing about the World Bank Enterprise surveys is it's a cross-country data collection exercise that uses the same methodology across countries. And there's a long period of time now on which we have data. So that could actually be used to get a sense of which firms are actually providing services And you can look at the performance of those firms through various lenses. I think what that third chapter in the primer kind of points to is the existence of national level type of sources of information that can complement what we see in the primer for these cross-country data sets, right? And ultimately, of course, for any government, but also I think for analysts, the interest is going to be very much on what's happening in my country, what's happening in our country. Are policies having the desired effect? What are the implications of services trade for employment, for sustainability? There's very, very many kind of dimensions and questions that are obviously of interest. And quite frequently, there's going to be national data sources that can be linked to the type of analysis that Ingo spoke to that you can do with the cross-country data on trade and services. So let me just briefly mention different sources. So one is many African countries have census data, right? So this is data on the operation of firms in the economy, but there's also censuses of people, right? So you can track where people are located in the country, what they do to earn money, right? So what is the employment that they, what's the sector of employment in which they operate? And that can be used to get a sense of tracking over time what is actually happening in terms of the growth of services in the economy and the implications for employment. There's a lot of firm level information in many African countries, which comes from the fact that you have value-added taxation, right? So when you have value-added tax systems, firms have to register what they sell to other firms, because that is going to be the basis of the value-added tax they're either going to pay or get back on their activities, right? So firms report what they sell to other firms, what they buy from other firms. You can use that type of data to identify the sector of operation of a firm. So are these firms selling services? Are these firms selling goods? And you can then trace through what is the services intensity of production in a particular economy, and what share of those services actually get exported, right? Because that is also something which is included in value-added tax information systems, right? So I think that's a source of data which is very much underused, but there's a number of countries in which that data has been applied. So I've done some work for the International Growth Center, but also for the World Bank in countries that include Rwanda, Uganda. We've also been working in South Africa. So there are countries with very detailed administrative microdata that can be used to get a much better sense of what is actually happening in terms of services in the economy, how are services feeding into export performance. And what that data also allows you to do, and here I'll come to the foreign direct investment dimension of the primer, where the primer makes very clear that foreign affiliate trade and services, so the sales by foreign companies that have established in a country, are generally much larger than trade and services measured on a balance of payments basis. Now, this varies very much depending on the country, right? So for some countries, tourism is very important. The balance of payments measure of services is actually bigger than foreign affiliate trade and services. But foreign direct investment is an important source of technology knowledge in the services sector. And we just heard the presentation about the Investment Promotion Agency in Nigeria. And many investment promotion agencies kind of keep track of who is investing in the country. So that's very valuable data because you know which firms are coming in, you know where those firms are going geographically. You also know what those firms are doing, right? Are they selling goods? Are they in agriculture? Are they providing services? So that's another source of valuable information where you can track through. So what do we actually get out of foreign direct investment from a services perspective? And one of the stylized facts of foreign direct investment is that most foreign direct investment is actually in the services sector, right? And that's partly because services are still more difficult to trade than goods. But then the interesting policy question then becomes, do we have foreign firms that are selling services, providing services in the domestic economy, and who is buying those services, right? So most services are going to go to other businesses. So if you have then, if you can link the foreign direct investment data with the value-added tax databases, you can trace through not just who's selling to whom, but also are these foreign firms that are selling and what are they selling, right? So it's a sort of information that I think is quite valuable from a policy making point of view. Now, what I've done in the chat, and I hit the send button a bit too soon, but I've basically linked to a number of papers that do this type of analysis, that use this type of data. Now, they're not written for ready consumption. These are all academic papers, so they're a bit technical, complicated. But you can see from the abstract, you can see from the data sources that are being used in those papers, how you can employ and apply national level databases to get answers to services trade related questions, right? So there's a paper in there that looks at the services intensity of production in Uganda using the type of data I just mentioned. We're also doing work with the Rwanda Development Board, which looks at what are the forward linkages that are implied by foreign direct investment, right? So what are foreign investors in Rwanda doing in terms of providing services to other firms, and how does that influence the performance of those firms in Rwanda, right? There's also a couple of papers in there that look across Africa that are multi-country papers that look at the use and that use census data, kind of get a sense of what is happening in terms of structural transformation in the economy over time. There's also another paper that uses the data sources that was just mentioned by the previous speaker, looking at greenfield foreign direct investment into African economies and figuring out, okay, so what does that actually do for performance of firms in the countries in which that investment takes place. So again, I'm not going to belabor the point. I think we want to open up the floor, have a discussion, but these are all just examples of what can be done using national level administrative micro data sources to could be on what is the effects of policies that are in place today. And that's my final point. We also want to come back to the primer. One of these additional sources of data that Ingo also mentioned is information on services trade policies. So the restrictiveness of policies with respect to services. And that's, again, an important complement to the trade data because you actually want to know, okay, so what are these policies doing to our trade performance? Right, and again, there's a paper in there that looks at alternative measures of trade policy and services, which have to do with allowing purchases to be made of services and getting paid for those services, and also allowing firms to invest in the country. What does that do for performance of firms in the economy? And again, it's just illustrative, but I think all of this is to say that complementing the services trade data that the primer is about, there's a lot of additional data sets that often exist at the national level that can be used to good effect to actually understand both the performance of firms in the economy, but also the impact of policies on the performance of those firms in terms of their access to services that they need to become competitive. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Bernard. So I would like to open the floor in the limited time that we have. We already have one question from Professor Ogunkola. It's good to see you here online. He said there is a need to recognize that quality of services matter, especially noting the fact that services are more and more contributing to goods production. Exactly. So that is exactly the point that we are making with the multi-year expert meeting that we are organizing on the 15th and 16th of April in Geneva, which has the topic servicification for economic diversification. It's basically the recognition of the fact that services are central for competitiveness. Now, of course, there are measurement issues there. I mean, as the primer said, there is trade and value added data. But of course, in our minds, high value in value added in domestic production might not necessarily mean competitiveness, right? It might also mean a lack of competition because of high prices. So there is some data on that gives insights to the servicification, to the importance of services for goods production. But of course, we need to know what the data sets say and what they don't say. So I think that is the point of the primer. But with that, I'm opening the floor for anybody who wishes to make any contribution. I think the point that was mentioned by Professor Hoekman on vet data, I think he was making the pitch of making more use of vet data. If anybody is interested in how we can actually do that, how can researchers like in the University of Nairobi look at, you know, this VAT data? How can the Nigeria Investment Promotion Agency make more use of VAT data? Maybe that is an interesting topic for discussion. But before that, I will give the floor to Professor Ogunkola. I think I have to promote you. Let me see.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, you can just, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this, and I'm happy to be here. And sorry, I came a little bit late. It was when Socrates was presenting. So pardon me if I'm repeating some of the things that you've discussed earlier on. Yes, thank you for the issue of quality of services and certification. And thank you for the information that, again, this has been looked into. But let me leave that one and focus on trade in agricultural services. Again, I know that FAO is already working on this. There may be a need for a collaborative engagement with FAO Africa, because the argument is that the performance of the agricultural sector rely heavily on services. And in fact, if you remove services from agricultural production, you will have a dual economy where the farmers are not actually relating with the modern economy. So services as relate to agriculture, at least to me, is one of the ways to promote inclusive development in Africa. And I believe there should be a way of incorporating this into your agenda. And the argument is that if you can make some of the services tradable across frontier in Africa, you are likely to promote regional integration more than using any other one. I hope this is in line with what you are thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Ogunkola. Indeed, I mean, our point has been that services are important for goods production. So whether we talk about agriculture, mining, or apparel. So I have some other questions in the chat. I mean, you're also free to raise your hand. I have here a question from Natasha Ward. Can Ingo speak a bit about Batis? I am working on Barbados national trade policy, and I see from Batis that our top service trade partner for 2024 is Netherlands. Our central bank and statistical service have no clue what on earth we could be trading with the Netherlands. So I think this is the point I was making, that 96% of the data points in the Batis are estimations. So maybe, Ingo, you can maybe interpolate a little bit about Batis.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, just very briefly, I mean, this is quite at some level of detail. So I certainly do not know either what, you know, the Caribbean or Barbados might be trading with Netherlands in terms of services. But, you know, as Peter said, that exactly sort of highlights some of the value added that we wanted to provide with the primer, so that you actually lift the bonnet and you look into the engine room and uncover, as it were, some of the ways in which these constructed data sets are being created. And for Batis in particular, it's instructive. You know, I don't want to sort of pass a value judgment, because Batis is a very valuable data set contribution. It's been widely used, but less than 4%, 3.9% are actually reported data points by national statistical authorities. And another 20% are actually derived zeros from zero trade flows to the world. And then that leaves about 2/3 or 68% of estimates from gravity models, right? And that, comes with an error. And maybe these kind of bilateral points that you are highlighting, Natasha, as between Barbados and the Netherlands, there's a sporting chance that this is a gravity model estimation and it may or may not be correct. So we take these, we should be taking the data, quote unquote, because some of them are actually estimates. It's not real data from these constructed data set with a grain of salt. Now, I think it's a good catch, right? We wouldn't know what is behind this, but if these inconsistencies, let's call them inconsistencies, surpass a certain threshold, it's actually worth the two statistical agencies getting into contact with each other. I don't know who's collecting this data in Barbados, probably the central bank. Talk to their colleagues in the Netherlands and see what's behind it. A good example for this is the trade asymmetry in services trade as between the United Kingdom and the United States. And both of them are sort of highly developed economies, with a lot of capacity in collecting and publishing services. Now, both the UK and the US have for a long time reported bilateral services trade surpluses with each other, which is logically sort of inconsistent, right? And so what has happened is that civil servants, both from Britain and from the US, have just sat down, have formed working committees and working groups and just try to get to the bottom of this. And it's not trivial, right? It's not that, these are sort of, it really needs to, it needs specialists to see which are the sectors that are driving these asymmetries. Is it financial services? Is it how we record margins in interest rate swaps? At that level of detail, these asymmetries arise. And maybe then, people can arrive at at least whittle away some of these differences. Before I get too much into detail, I guess I'll stop.
Yeah, thank you. That is very clear. I think this reminds me when I was working on the EPAs, Economic Partnership Agreements, which were on goods. In fact, the trade data on goods was actually negotiated trade data because, there are always mismatches. So basically the EU and West Africa ECOWAS Commission, they sat together, they said, okay, what is actually the trade data? So because you had to reach a certain threshold, right? I think 78. What is in the end 80%?
No. Maybe I can just close off with two remarks, and that's a testament to the good questions that we got in the chat and elsewhere. Professor Ogunkola was saying that FAO is actually monitoring trade and agricultural services, and I put my hands up. I didn't know this, right? After the primer was published late in 2025, the International Monetary Fund also seemingly put out another global bilateral trade and services data set, which couldn't be reflected in the primer. And all of this goes to showing that it really is a moving target, right? And we should be keeping the conversation up with a view towards keeping this resource up to date and current for everyone. And I think we should also be looking outside of the box. So from a number of African economies who are evidently good at tourism, right? I think the colleague from SADC said that only one economy, I think it was either Burundi or Rwanda, only one economy was doing a full-fledged survey, and the others were sort of focusing on what they were evidently good at, right? But I think we also need to be forward-looking, and we need to start collecting data about kinds of services that are perhaps not that quantitatively important yet, but could be important for strengthening that economy's manufacturing competitiveness. So Peter is back. I stop baffling. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so thank you for helping me close it. Thank you so much. There were some technical issues with echoes. So let's just close it at that. I think we have to continue the conversation. There were several other questions in the chat. There were even some requests for other English-speaking webinars. So maybe and also this morning we had quite a show up of more than 300 people. So I think this topic resonates with many stakeholders. So your suggestions for follow-up webinars are very much welcome, and I think yeah, we leave it at that. So please read the primer. Please have a check at our work. Have a look at the MIAM, the multi-year expert meeting on trade, services, and development. Read the background paper on servicification for economic diversification, and let's continue the conversation. So thank you so much for your participation, for the speakers, and for the participants. Thank you so much.